Cool. Thanks, brother.
You bet.
Yeah. My name's Hector Garcia. I'm the founder and brand guardian of a boutique branding and packaging firm in Southern California. And anyhow, I've invited a bunch of people. I see some of my 10-star peeps in here. Thank you for joining. Got some friends from the East Coast and all over the country. We're here in Southern California, freezing and like, what is it, like 70 degrees right now, Ed?
Yeah, I'm
So,
gonna go put a sweater on.
yeah, exactly. So anyhow, through my Renaissance Executive Forum Business Group and Rick Franzi, he had Michael Reddington on in December, and I was pretty astounded by the amount of leadership information and little tips and tricks that I learned just in one Zoom call, stuff that I could apply to my business and my employees. And it's all about leadership. I'm a lifelong learner, and I just loved it. So, you know, Michael and I hit it off after the Zoom call. We talked, we chatted, we connected, and anyhow, it's a pleasure to have Michael present to us today. And like I said, thank you all for joining. I can't imagine, you know, it's so cool to see all your smiling faces on camera. So with that, I'll turn it over to Michael and enjoy. I'm sure you're going to take away some nuggets that you can use in your everyday, you know, businesses. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Ed, and thank you, Hector. I appreciate all your work in putting this together, and thank you all for taking the time to join us today. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you for allowing me to interrupt your breakfast, your coffee, or your lunch, whichever it is. I certainly appreciate it. And our goal today, as Hector and Ed mentioned, is to really maximize the 90 minutes or so that we have, and hopefully impart as much information as we can that everybody here can turn around and begin applying really in all of their conversations. We have this session built around leadership. However, the techniques that we're going to talk about today are techniques that I use in 100% of my important conversations in all aspects of business and family and social life as well. So I'll give you guys just a quick rundown of my background. I don't want to take up too much time with that. And then we're going to dive into the good stuff. I do have the chat box open in front of me, and I do believe that questions tend to be more valuable when they are answered within the context that they were thought of. So if you have any questions at any time, please don't hesitate to throw them in the chat box. If I miss one, I'm sure Ed has his eagle's eyes on it, and we'll make sure we get them answered. If we get a whole bunch and we don't have time, I'll answer them after the fact. I'll answer them by email and make sure everybody has them that way. I believe Ed has told everyone this is being recorded, and we'll share the slides after. So there'll be a full follow-up communication with all of the material after the program as well. So I am by trade a certified forensic interviewer and an executive resource. And when I say that, people often think the first question is, well, Mike, how does a certified forensic interviewer also serve as an executive resource? Well, in the interest of time, I actually started out as a school teacher, teaching 8th grade special education and coaching baseball was going to be my career, until I let myself get peer pressured in any number of career directions before accidentally ending up with an investigations job that clearly has gotten entirely out of control long before now. So in my role as an investigator, one day I was literally asked to conduct an interrogation. An employee was suspected of theft. They didn't have anybody else to do it. I did it, and I'd rather be lucky than good. The young man confessed to the items he stole. So after that, they started sending me to training programs, and I really became completely fascinated. I'm not going to try to choose my words here, but truly fascinated with not just the conversational piece or getting somebody to say I did it truthfully, but really the cognitive process, the emotional relationship, all the things that go into play that causes somebody who woke up that morning saying, I'm never going to tell anybody this, to not only tell me, but write it down and sign it at the end of the conversation. So as my career progressed and I earned my certified forensic interviewer designation, and I ran the investigations program for the world leader in non-confrontational interview and interrogation training and advising, and traveled the world teaching investigators in government agencies, law enforcement, and private sector organizations how to obtain the truth by rapport-based means, I started to have really two fortunate opportunities. One, I was paid to talk to people who didn't want to talk to me. There's a lot to learn in those situations. Two, I got to spend time with a lot of people like Hector and Ed, who I'm only recently getting to know, who brought me into work with their teams and then started picking my brain for how we could apply these techniques to their conversations. With that motivation, I took the leash off of my inner nerd, dove into research across the spectrum of business communication, and arrived at two very important realizations. The first is the very best leaders and the very best interrogators capitalize on the same two core skills: vision and influence. And maybe more surprisingly, the cognitive process that interrogation suspects experience when they truthfully commit to saying "I did it" is essentially identical to the cognitive processes that customers experience when they commit to saying "I'll buy it," and employees experience when they commit to saying "I'll do it." So with those realizations in hand, I had several conversations with my previous employer, and we hugged and agreed to go our separate ways in a very supporting relationship. And at that point, I created my own organization, Persuasive, used the research that I had created on top of my investigations background to create the disciplined listening method, and dedicated myself to teaching leaders how to apply strategic, ethical, observation, and persuasion techniques in all of their conversations. So this session, Leadership Lessons from the Interrogation Room, is exactly what it sounds like. In those conversations, and I truly believe that interrogations are white hot microcosms of leadership. Generally, there's two people in a room with drastically opposed motivations, emotions, concerns, goals, yet we find a way in a finite period of time in order to work through those and arrive at sharing the truth together. And as a point of context, for my former teammates and I to get called, they didn't have evidence. If they had it, they would have taken care of it themselves. So we got calls when there was multiple suspects, no evidence. Everybody had already been interviewed at least once, had already asserted that they knew nothing and did nothing. Several weeks or months had went by. And then when a leader within the organization decided they couldn't handle it anymore, they called us. And we had to go in those situations where really 52 out of 52 cards in the deck are stacked against us, and identify the truth in that situation. And thankfully, we were consistently quite successful in those endeavors. So what we're going to do today are discuss the communication techniques, the skills, the perspectives, and the techniques that we used in those situations, and talk about how we can apply them to all of our business conversations as well. I do have the chat box open. There'll be a couple times I throw questions out there. And if you can put your sandwich or your coffee or your omelet down just long enough to type in a quick response, I'd certainly appreciate it. And we'll keep the conversation rolling as we go through. Please don't hesitate to interrupt me at any time.
No, I guess
So to get started, one of the first things we want to do is talk about what does it mean to be a disciplined listener. Well, I'm going to save that question for the next slide. Hector, the next question I ask is for you, but I'm going to save it for the next slide. What does it mean to be a disciplined listener? I'm sure all of us are quite familiar with active listening, which is great. When we think about things like maintaining eye contact and smiling and nodding, and hopefully not so much mirroring so it doesn't come off as insincere, but matching somebody's body language, maybe summarizing some of what they say, those are all great things to do. When we think about it, those techniques can, in theory, keep us more engaged in the conversation. However, the priority for those techniques is to make sure the person who is speaking to us believes that we're listening. Therefore, they're likely to continue talking. I'm willing to bet that if we took a vote, which we won't, everybody on this call is quite skilled at maintaining pretty good eye contact, smiling, nodding, occasionally summarizing the last thing you heard, while entirely ignoring somebody and thinking about everything else you have to do that day or next weekend or what your next priority in this conversation is. And that's totally natural. Our internal monologue runs at a rate that's about 4 times faster, and that might actually not be the right number. I should go back. It could be even faster than that. About 4 times faster than we can speak out loud. So when we look at disciplined listening, active listening still applies 100%. The next jump with disciplined listening is how do we put ourselves in position to acquire as much strategic intelligence as possible in any important conversation, and then apply that strategic intelligence to help us get closer to achieving our goals. So with that, there are 6 core behaviors that disciplined listeners consistently demonstrate. The first one is prior to entering into any conversation, they understand how this conversation can get them even one step closer to obtaining both their long-term and short-term goals. I know this sounds kind of trite. Well, understand what your goals are in any situation. So many times we don't think about that. So many times we look at our calendar and we look at one conversation, one meeting, one call, the next, and we're just focused on getting through those without stopping to realize that realistically, every relationship we have is iterative. And depending on your industry, depending on what you do, not only is that direct relationship iterative, but where are the ripple effects? If the person you talk to today throws a stone over their shoulder, how many of those ripples are going to hit other people that are in our world, our industry, our network? So we really stop to think prior to entering into any conversation, not just what am I looking to get out of this, but how can this conversation get me closer over time to achieving my long-term goals? A friend of mine down in Austin calls it playing the long game. How do I use this conversation to continue to get me closer and closer to where I need to be? With that in mind, disciplined listeners leverage their perceived weaknesses in order to create their communication strategies. There are roughly 163 cognitive biases that impact how we communicate in any conversation. The majority of them are designed to help us feel comfortable and consistent with what we already think and believe. So it is too easy for us to overestimate, for us to overevaluate our position, or for us to not quite truly empathize or understand where somebody else is. Coming up in just a few slides, I'm going to show you the exact questions that we ask ourselves prior to engaging in any important conversation to help us do this. But realistically speaking, when I go into any conversation, I want to be confident. I want to have a good plan. I want to believe in myself. And with that, I want to be situationally aware enough to understand where I may have some perceived weaknesses in this situation and how I can use them to my advantage. From there, once we engage in the conversation, we don't want to listen for information. Just check the box. Okay, got it. Now I can use those 3 pieces of information to fit somebody into a preordained box I've already imagined, and then offer them something that fits that box that I just fit them in. What's really dangerous is 3 different research studies from 2 different sides of the Atlantic, 3 different universities, all have proven that we are capable of classifying somebody, fitting them within one of our mental models, and judging their trustworthiness within 100 milliseconds. And then spending the rest of the conversation looking for information that verifies those split-second decisions. So if all we're doing is checking the box for information, we could be really shorting ourselves on some new and unexpected opportunities. So for us to identify strategic intelligence, we really want to look at and listen for the nuances of the communication. We could probably spend more than 90 minutes. We could probably spend a whole day on overcoming myths associated with identifying when people are lying and myths associated with reading nonverbal and verbal behavior. I will say this for the time we have today. There is no single behavior that's always indicative of truth or deception. And the research is clear. None of us are anywhere near as consistent at it as we believe we are. And we tend to get ourselves in more trouble when we think we are catching somebody lying. More often than not all the time. So what we can reliably detect in our conversations are emotional shifts. So what we look for when we're talking to people is during the conversation, do we see shifts in their communication that are emblematic of changes in their comfort level? Do they now appear to be more or less comfortable than they previously were? If so, why? What does it mean to me in the context of this situation, and how can I use that to my advantage? We're not trying to catch people lying, no matter what you've seen on TV. We're looking for indications of comfort and discomfort that we can then capitalize on those motivations to get closer to our goals. We then adapt to apply the strategic intelligence in the conversations that we're participating in. I think everybody here is well aware of the fact that you could have the world's greatest plan on paper, engage in your conversation, and somewhere between 30 seconds and 3 minutes later, that plan is no longer valid. So being aware enough that we're receiving new information and we have new opportunities becomes very important. This may be the linchpin to the whole thing. How we communicate with people has a direct impact on what they're willing to share. And what they're willing to share has a direct impact on what we have the opportunity to observe. And what we have the opportunity to observe directly impacts the decisions we make and the results we achieve. We should be going out of our way to help people protect their self-images during these conversations. Help people save face, protect their self-image, not feel judged, not feel attacked. I have video after video after video of my former teammates and I debriefing people after they have confessed with us, as well as conducting research interviews with people who've been interrogated by other people. And time after time after time, the number one reason why they say they were willing to tell the truth is because they didn't feel judged. The more we can help people protect their self-image, the more we can help build commitment to any number of new opportunities. And then finally, build trust equity through post-conversation follow-up. There is only one way to prove to somebody that you listen to them. We can smile all we want during the conversation. We can summarize all we want during the conversation. At the end of the conversation, we can tell them we're going to do something, and everybody can walk away feeling great. But if we don't follow up after the conversation, if we don't give them tangible proof that we listened, they don't believe that we did. I'm sure everybody here can think of a conversation with somebody that felt great, and a day, a week, a month later, nothing changed. They didn't listen. If they listened, they would have done something about it. I'm pretty sure I've heard my wife say that a few times now that I stop and think about it. But if we want someone to truly believe that we've listened, we have to follow up after the conversation and give them the tangible evidence that we listened. So with those 6 behaviors in mind, the next thing that I do want to share are the 7 stages that people experience when they participate in potentially contentious conversations. And we say potentially, meaning we're going to participate in a conversation that has all the fuel necessary. It just needs the spark. It might not become contentious, but it could. It's there. So when you talk to people who work for you in your organization, when you talk to people who you teach or otherwise are responsible for something for you in your universities, I'm sure many people on the call here serve on some sort of nonprofit board or do community work or coach youth sports or any number of analogous scenarios. If we find ourselves in a leadership position and we need to have a conversation with somebody else that could become contentious, there are 7 phases that they are going to navigate during that conversation. And we want to make sure we share them to add the context before we dive into more detail. But I would like to ask you guys this, and I'll keep my eye on the chat box. I'll try to keep the answer options as short as possible for everybody. If you are a leader within your organization, doesn't matter what it is, CEO, CFO, vice president, district manager, doesn't matter. If you're a leader within your organization, do you think, let me ask it this way. If you're a leader within your organization, what impact do you think your job title alone has on your audience's willingness to share truthful, timely, and thorough information with you? Do you think your title impacts their willingness to do so? I'm sorry, let me say it this way. Do you think your title increases their willingness to do so, decreases their willingness to do so, or has no impact? Again, do you think your title increases, decreases, or has no impact on your audience's willingness to share truthful, timely, and thorough information? Catherine, thank you. I see a yes there. Anybody else want to dive in with your thoughts? David, maybe it's negative. Thank you. Anybody else? Everyone else is like, oh, cool. Catherine and David took care of us. We're all set. We'll get them on the next one. Lisa, possibly negative. Steve, depends on the situation. Steve, you're right. Of course, everything is contextually important. I think it depends. Early Jacks, Ed, high impact, people get more timid. Steve, your statement is correct. Everything is contextually based. To paint with an unfair broad brush, in general terms, our job titles, and Regina, depends on the relationship. Relationships aside, because you're right, our job titles generally have a significant negative impact on the information our audiences are willing to share with us. Because the greater the role your title illustrates, the more power you have over their life. It's not just to hire and fire and choose how much they get paid. It might be what projects they're working on. It might be who they partner with. It might be their role in any conversation around a conference room table. It could just be feeling embarrassed or misunderstood. So the first thing that is very important to remember in the academic community, which I know many of you come from, it's often referred to as a +1 and -1 relationship. The person with the leadership title is the +1. The person without that title is the -1. So from a leadership standpoint, I'm willing to bet many of you work really hard, open door policy, come to me anytime. I help you any way that I can. And I bet you are sincere in all of those efforts. However, what we have to realize is despite our most sincere efforts, we still might not be able to fully overcome somebody else's life experiences, which is why understanding the 7 stages of contentious conversations becomes so very important. Let me ask you guys this. When, not just for you, but for your audience, if you schedule a meeting with somebody and you say, it's Wednesday, you send them a calendar invite and say, we need to talk Friday morning. When does that conversation actually start for them? What do you guys think? I'm watching the chat box. Immediately. Lisa, that's a great answer. As soon as they get the calendar invite, that's a great answer. Catherine, right away. It started before the meeting, really. You are correct. Right then, the moment we say we need to meet, Ed, you're there. Right away, Lorianne, thank you. Are you and Ed cheating? I just want to make sure that you're not reading off each other's notepads. You're all right-ish. Your conversation with your audience started the very first time you ever met them. And unfortunately, it likely started even before that. Because as we grow up in our lives, we build mental models for authority figures, maybe from our parents, our coaches, our bosses, our teachers, depending on how much fun you had growing up, the police. We build mental models for how we believe leaders will treat us. And unfortunately, that's not always positive. So we carry those mental models as we go through life. And in order for us to truly believe that it's going to be different, we're going to need proof, tangible evidence that our expectations have been violated. So somebody joins your organization, whatever their life experiences are, they bring with them. Literally the very first time you meet them, think about this. We're capable of judging somebody's trustworthiness and categorizing them inside 100 milliseconds. From the very first time they meet you, they are already sizing you up for how this relationship may go. And then over time, as tense or difficult situations or mistakes happen, as learning opportunities arise, how we handle each and every one of those determines how they're going to prepare for the real big conversation when it happens. I have a 3-year-old son. So literally every little thing that he feels sorry for, that I need to correct him for, he needs to say, Daddy, I did this for, I am going out of my way already to be as empathetic and understanding and educational with those because he's my kid. So by the time he turns, I don't know, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, those problems could get a lot bigger. So I have to realize I'm setting the stage now for how we will be able to navigate the conversations when bigger problems arise. And the same thing is true with our employees. Literally with everybody we interact with, it's probably safe to assume we're going to have at least one uncomfortable conversation with them by the time our relationship is complete. So we may as well, from the jump, treat them in a way that is respectful and empathetic, that builds rapport, that tries to understand their perspective. So when those times come, we're in position to be more respectful. I say all that to lead in. The very first stage of the conversation is the pre-conversation. That is literally everything that happened in their life prior to joining your organization. which is super unfair, by the way, than every interaction they've had with you and your leadership team since they've been there. That is going to form their expectations. Phase 2 of the conversation is the introduction. And I cannot overstate the importance of the introduction to the conversation, whether that is on the phone, on video, or in person. One of the things that used to drive me up a wall sideways is when I would consult with investigative teams and the suspect or the victim or the witness, whoever it was, would show up. And the lead interrogator would have almost like a bully introduction. Come in, sit down. I have some questions. Like, I'm sorry, what? This person probably walked in not sure they want to tell you what color the ocean is, let alone any sensitive information. And that's how we treat them when they walk in the door? How's that going to work? Ed joked earlier, for those that were on earlier, I was going through several of my calls this morning and somehow managed to potentially misplace the link to this meeting. So instead of looking and risking a closer to deadline entrance, I just called Ed. But as I'm dialing the phone, I'm thinking to myself, when Ed answers the phone and hears my voice, he's probably not going to think this is a good phone call. So literally, as soon as he said hello, I said, hey, Ed, it's Mike Reddington. Everything's great here. How you doing? Because I literally want to ease that tension right away so I can just get the link and log in and we can kick this thing off. So how we manage our introductions are critical. I see a note here. Early says, I feel like we use our desks as a power move towards other people. We absolutely do. And in fact, if you dive into Ed Hall's research, using Ed Hall and Judy Burgoon's research as the motivation for this, anytime we have a critical conversation, an investigative interview, a job candidate interview, an important business meeting or conversation, I position my chairs roughly 4 feet apart, chest to chest, with no barriers in between them whatsoever, in order to avoid that exact same thing from happening. And when I say that, and when we're legally allowed to teach classes in person, people look at those chairs and think, oh my goodness, that's so close. Well, watch the evening news. Before the Super Bowl this weekend, when they do 900 hours of never-ending pregame coverage, watch the interviews that they do. Well, I can't do them in person this year, I guess, so it won't be the same. But they set their chairs about 4 feet apart for their interviews. They just angle them slightly towards the camera so people can see them. That's all. The introduction is important. And to your point, sir, we absolutely get out from behind that desk as often as possible. Without getting too distracted and keeping an eye on the clock, I was fortunate enough to spend 2 weeks teaching executives in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. And when I was in Kenya, one of the CEOs had lunch with me, and he was talking about how his team perceives him and how he doesn't get a lot of communication during their meetings. And I looked at him and I said, let me make a guess. I said, what's that? I said, you sit in the tallest chair at the far end of the table. And he's like, yeah, I'm supposed to. So, well, there's problem number one, my man. I said, for the next meeting, get there early and sit in the middle of the table. He literally looks at me. I'll never forget this. His name is his seat, and says, you'll think I lost my marbles. For about 10 seconds, yeah, probably. But by the end of the first meeting, the dynamic of the room is going to change. And 5 meetings later, when they realize this is a permanent change in who you are, the dynamic of the room will change, and so won't the communication. 2 weeks later, I get an email from him. I felt so foolish the first time. I can't thank you enough. Sometimes it's these little things we do and how we position ourselves with the people that we speak with that really, truly makes a big difference. The next one is now they start to listen. And as people start to listen, they're essentially listening for, what is this conversation about and what does it have to do with me? Now, at some point in that early listening stage, they're going to transition into internalization and self-talk. Now that they believe they've identified what this is about, and they believe they've identified what this has to do with them, they start now talking to themselves. What should I say? What shouldn't I say? Under what conditions should I say them? How easy is this conversation going to be? How difficult is this conversation going to be? How much do I believe or trust this person? There's one research study out of the world of interrogation I can quote that says at this point in time, they're likely listening to roughly 30% of what you're saying tops. Now, once they have talked to themselves for long enough, they're going to determine what they're willing to say and when they're willing to say it, under what conditions. Now, once they start speaking, they're going to choose. Is this a conversation I want to continue participating in or not? And choosing not doesn't necessarily mean getting up and walking away. It could sit there silently. It could be start kind of acting like a child and pushing back or providing evasive answers. But they can decide, is this a conversation I want to continue participating in or not? And then, of course, we have the post-conversation follow-up. So as we look at these 7 steps, the first 2 are essentially one and done. All of that happens before the conversation starts or as it starts. The post-conversation follow-up is after the conversation. But when you go from begin to listen all the way through choose to participate, those are rinse and repeat. As the conversation continues, as topics continue, as different people enter the conversation or take different roles in the conversation, as they start to identify what are the potential consequences of this conversation, rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat. There's an untold number of times that they could go through those processes. Catherine, I see, what if they start debating you? We could spend, again, a whole session just talking about that. For us, it's very important to try to think, where is that debate truly coming from? What are they trying to do? And then generally speaking, our mantra is don't argue, accept. If somebody is trying to metaphorically, hopefully, pick a fight, the last thing we want to do is give it to them because now they have home field advantage. So what we want to do is agree and move on. For me, one of the favorite things I used to love to get in the interrogation room is somebody would say, I don't have to sit here. Somebody would say, I don't have to answer that question. And I would look at them right in the face and say, you're right, you don't. At which point you could see their face change as they were like, well, that's not going to work. Or when somebody would say, I don't have to sit here and listen to this. And I would say, you're right, you don't. You can get up and walk out of here anytime you want. I had a perfect record until about 2000 and I'm gonna say 14. And by perfect record, I don't mean confession rate, don't take it that way. I had a perfect record of nobody getting up and leaving until 2014, when I was interrogating a woman who had taken drug tests for her little brother so he wouldn't get fired. And honestly, to give her credit, she refused to say anything and got up and left to avoid getting her brother in trouble. She resigned her position as the director of HR to avoid getting her brother in trouble. So although I certainly can't condone what happened, you got to give somebody credit for taking care of their family, I guess, even in that situation. So Catherine, if you'd like to talk about more of that later, I'm more than happy to, of course. So as we transition now into actually interacting with people, we quickly want to share 3 ways to kill a conversation before it starts. And with this, I know there's at least one here that Hector enjoyed the last time he and I were together. So here are 3 things that we all have the potential of doing without realizing, unintentionally, that can truly kill a conversation before it even starts. The first one is walk past, it says employees, but really people, walk past people without saying hello. Now, some of us certainly could still be in a remote environment where we're not seeing people every day. If you are the leader of the organization, people are logging on to your virtual calls, personally say their name and say hello to them as they log in. Every single person, doesn't matter how long it takes or how awkward it feels. If you're walking down the hall and you walk past somebody and you don't say hello, the message they just received is they don't exist in your world. They literally were not important enough to be acknowledged at that point in time. If you're walking with 5 other people, it doesn't matter. I've been teaching this for years. I'm sure I'm not the only one that does. Pre-COVID, I was in a meeting in downtown Charlotte, which they call uptown Charlotte, whatever. And I was on an elevator. The door was starting to close. I held it. It just so happened, I didn't see what was coming. I just heard voices that Jeff Gordon gets on with a couple other people. Jeff Gordon, one of the best race car drivers ever, gets on the elevator with me. He's literally talking to these 4 other guys. They're all wearing suits. I'm sure they're all super important, going to some very important meeting. I held the door. Jeff was in mid-conversation with them, turns around, looks at me and says, thanks, man, nods his head and goes back to the conversation. If he can step out of that conversation for a second to acknowledge a complete stranger, we have absolutely no excuses to walk by somebody and not say hello. Because all we have to do is walk by somebody 3 or 4 times, not acknowledge them, and now we don't care. Now, when we do have to have that difficult conversation with them, they've already made up their mind. It doesn't matter. And by the way, the higher we are on the org chart and the lower they are on the org chart, the more important it is that we say hello when we pass them. The next one is the unintentional idea thief. I'm sure when we do this, it's all about trying to build rapport with somebody. However, that's often not how they perceive it. So let's say that Ed comes to me and says, hey, Mike, I got a question. How do I do this? I say, great question. Walk me through your ideas. Ed gives me his first idea and I love it. So I look at him and I say, Ed, that's a great idea. Go for it. That's exactly what I was thinking. As soon as I say that's exactly what I was thinking, I steal the idea from Ed. When he hears good idea, great idea, go do it, that's received as he was up to the challenge. He succeeded. Now he's going to go execute his own idea. But if I say that's exactly what I was thinking, that changes the dynamic entirely. Now, instead of him thinking he rose to the occasion and solved this, he just happened to match what I already had in mind. Which, by the way, if I already had that in mind, why didn't I just tell him? If there's a great relationship in place, or it only happens occasionally, probably not that big a deal. But if we're in the habit of telling people that's exactly what I was thinking, we are literally stealing credit of the idea from them before they even get started. And the final one that we have is when somebody asks us for help and we say, I only have 5 minutes. Anytime we are focusing on time over quality, quality suffers. That is not just true for production or design or creative work, Hector. That is true for relationships as well. Time is the enemy of empathy, period. Anytime we are focusing on the ticking clock in the back of our heads, we are losing the ability to truly empathize and connect with anybody else around us. That's where our mind's eye is focused. That's what is driving our behavior. If I'm stepping out of my office and Hector comes up to me and says, hey, Mike, I got a question. And I look at him and I say, hey, Hector, dude, I got a meeting with Ed in 2 minutes. And you know how Ed gets if we're late. So quick. As soon as I tell Hector I only have 2 minutes, I literally just told him he's not worth 3 minutes of my life. Now, there's a reasonable likelihood that whatever, sorry, I'm speaking in circles. Whatever Hector has to tell me is going to take less than 2 minutes, maybe 3 tops. When people say that's not true, I kind of giggle a little bit because I'm fortunate enough to train, coach, and compete in jiu-jitsu, at least at the local level. And our fights are 5 minutes long. And let me make you a promise. A lot can happen in 5 minutes. A lot can happen in 5 minutes. So to say to Hector, for Hector to approach me, and I'm thinking in my head, all right, I got to get to Ed's office in 2 minutes. If I look at him and say, yeah, man, what's up? What you got? And I let him tell me, relax. The clock's going to take care of itself. We don't need to watch it. We don't need to think about it. It's still going to keep ticking. Hector finishes what he says. And now I can say, thank you, man. I want to be respectful of your time and I don't want to shortchange this conversation. I'm going to be to Ed's office, well, a minute ago, but I'll worry about that. Let's look at our calendars real quick. When do you have a half an hour that we can talk about this so we can sync up? If we listen to their answer first and then tell them we only have 2 minutes or we're out of time and we need to find another time, at least we listen to them first. And by listening to them first, the message is we care. If we tell them we only have 2 minutes, now the message becomes we don't care. These little things we say and do every day can have a significant impact on the information people will share with us. Early in my career, one of the random things that I'm most proud of is I led a team of investigators for an organization that not only for 2 years straight led the organization in the amount of successful investigations resolved, but also led the investigation in employee tips, meaning employees who are snitching out other employees. Those two numbers are almost always inverted. They have an inverse relationship. The more cases you close, the less people want to talk to you. Well, on our team, we focused on things like this, little things every day, which meant that even as we were identifying and resolving record numbers of employee investigations, we were still obtaining record numbers of employee tips based on how we treated everybody outside of the interview room and inside of the interview room as well to get those admissions. So as we keep this train rolling, I would like to ask you guys another question. Often as we prepare for these conversations, it's easy to ask ourselves, why should somebody do what we want them to do? Why should Hector agree to this? Why should Ed agree to this? Why should Catherine want to do what I want Catherine to do? So here's my question to you, and I'll keep an eye on the chat box. When we ask ourselves, if I was to ask myself, we'll do it this way. If I was to ask myself, why should Ed do what I want him to do? Do you think I'm focusing on Ed's perspective or my perspective? I'll watch the chat box. Ed, I see yours. Early, I see yours. Robin Ann, thank you. Yours. Kirsten, your perspective. Stephanie, yours. You're all right, 100%. I'm focusing on mine. If I'm to ask myself, why should Ed do this? Thank you for everyone who's continuing to answer. If I ask myself, why should Ed do this? I'm literally transposing my perspective onto Ed and could quite likely be overvaluing my position in this situation, my skills, my opportunities. One of the single most important lessons I learned from a career in investigative interviewing interrogation was that when I speak with people, they have far more motivation not to share information with me than they do. So in order to use that to my advantage, I completely changed how I prepared for those conversations. And after reaping the rewards, this is now how I prepare for every single important conversation I have on my calendar. As I prepare for any important conversation, the first question I ask myself is the opposite. Why shouldn't they commit to what I need them to? So if I can think of everything I know about Ed, what are all the things I know about him and his situation and the alternatives he may have that should cause him to not want to commit to this? Then there's a sister question that goes with it. Why hasn't he already committed to what I need him to? Now, there's two general answers to this. Answer number one, in fairness, is he didn't know it was an option. Answer number two is he didn't see the value in it. And so if it's answer number two, I've got to figure out why. And because I'm a bit of a caveman, I still love a pen and paper. I will literally grab a piece of paper, draw a line down the middle, and on the left-hand side, I will write down all the reasons I can think of why somebody shouldn't and hasn't already done what I want them to do. Then I'm going to study that list. And on the opposite side of that line, I'm going to ask myself, what is my goal? And how will everything I say and do help me achieve it? And now I'm literally going to go down this list on the left-hand side and say, how do I use these to my advantage? From the time of the conversation to the setup, to who's involved, to what information I show when, what questions I ask, in what order, everything. And I use this for all my sales calls, always. Anytime I'm preparing for a sales call, I ask myself, why shouldn't this person do business with me and why haven't they already? And I generate my strategy off of that. Sales, negotiations, coaching with a reluctant employee. It works with students potentially who aren't doing their work, assuming they actually want to do their work or have other motivation to do their work. Interviews as well, candidate interviews as well as investigative interviews. Literally every important conversation, this is the preparation process that I use. And it all stemmed from the fact that one beautiful day, I realized the people, thank you, David. I realized the person that I was going to interview that day literally had no good reason to tell me the truth. Like, I laughed when I thought about it on the airplane. They're 99% of the way through getting away with this. Why should they say anything to me? Well, honestly, they shouldn't. Sweet. Now that I'm totally cool with that, let's go get the truth. And it was literally a revolutionary day for me. Like, it was opened up a whole new world of success. So once we're prepared and we're engaging in the conversation, I'm going to take a look at the chat box again and ask you guys to riddle me this. What do you think is the most important part of listening? If we truly want to be outstanding listeners, what's the most important thing that we have to do in order to be great listeners? I'll watch the chat box. Just listen, don't talk back. Catherine, I love it. Robin Ann, stop talking. I love it. Limit distractions, eye contact, not talk. Love it, love it, love it. All of those are correct, and I'm really not good at math, but I feel like 4 for 6 out of that first batch of answers. Be in the moment is the same, really care about what they're saying is the same. The single most important part of listening is talking. And I said that the right way. I'll probably screw something else up later. But seriously, the most important part of listening is talking, because I believe we all know when we're talking, we're not listening. But it goes deeper than that. Our brains aren't good at multitasking. That's why we shouldn't text and drive or do any number of things at the same time. I don't know how many of you have tried to talk on the phone and send an email at the same time. I don't know if any of those conversations felt like they were happening in English or Spanish or whatever your language of choice is at the time. They both were probably pretty mixed up. So for me, if I'm talking, I literally don't have the cognitive power left to truly listen to somebody. But even worse, if somebody's trying to talk to me and I interrupt them, which by the way, research shows is the #1 mistake interviewers make across disciplines. If I interrupt somebody while they're talking to me, it literally tells them that I don't care. What they have to say to me isn't value, isn't important enough. Craig's post, if you don't have the chat box up, says studies have shown that 40% of our time, our minds are distracted from the task at hand. Yeah, 100%. At 47 might be low, not questioning the research, just thinking about my own time if I'm doing something else and trying to listen or pay attention somewhere else. So we know that talking stops us from listening. We know that talking gives the impression to other people that we're not listening. But here's the problem. The single most detrimental conversation that has the biggest negative impact on our ability to listen doesn't happen out here. It happens in here. Our internal monologue. I have a very sad fact to share. If I am talking to you while you are talking to yourself, you're not listening to me. I have nothing more important to say to you than you have to say to yourself. If we can only focus on one thing at a time, somebody else's voice is going to win out over our voice. Not a chance. So if we truly want to use listening to continue to evolve as leaders, the very first thing we need to do is limit our internal monologue. Because unfortunately, not only does our internal monologue serve as a distraction, it also tends to focus on our emotions, how we're feeling, how this conversation affects us, what we want to say next, where we think we have to go next. All of this is completely focused on us and can take us off track and get us away from truly understanding what someone else is thinking and feeling at any moment in time. If we think about it, when we're engaged in a conversation and we're observing somebody else's communication, we take that observation without all the necessary meaning. And then we have to fill in the blanks. We have to give that story meaning based on our life history and perspective. That meaning is what caused us to generate our emotion. It's not the observation. It's the meaning that we give that observation. And then that emotion drives whatever we say or do next. So in order for us to ensure that we are not only more thoroughly, but more accurately evaluating and understanding our counterparts, we've got to stay quiet up here as much as possible. One of the things that we like to say is, especially if we feel ourselves getting emotional, whatever first words come into your brain, swallow them. Do not say them, because there's a significant likelihood that they're going to be based on how we feel, not on what our audience needs to hear to continue the conversation. So rule number 1, please limit your internal monologue. Number 2 is maintain a learning mentality, which guess what? Our brains aren't wired to do. Our brains are wired to look for information that validates what we already believe and ignore information that contradicts what we already believe. If we engage with somebody for 5 to 10 minutes and don't learn one thing from that engagement, a new perspective, a new thought, a new idea, a new understanding or appreciation, it's our fault. That's my personal opinion. One of the things that drives me up a wall sideways with investigators, with sales teams, with CEOs, is when I'm working with them and they say, "Don't worry, Mike, I got this all figured out." You do. When investigators used to tell me that, I would laugh and say, "Really? So that means you were there when the crime occurred?" And then they would get all kinds of upset with me because of their righteous indignation as the investigator in this situation. But seriously, who knows more about any crime? The person that committed it or the person that's investigating it? Let's be serious. Sales, we think about our customers. Teachers, we think about our students. Leaders, we think about our employees. Parents, we think about our kids. Do we really know every single thing they're thinking and feeling? No, we probably have a good idea from experience, but we don't. So if we go into a conversation thinking we already have it figured out, naturally we're looking for information to confirm that, which could be super dangerous. Literally, when I have important meetings or if I go to a presentation, if I've got a piece of paper with me, on the top of the paper, I will write, what did I learn today? And after that conversation, if I've got nothing written down, that's on me, with rare exception. That's on me. The next one is please let the conversation come to you. And Craig, I just saw you write, be curious. Please let the conversation come to you. We said before, time is the enemy of empathy. If I'm going into a conversation with Hector thinking, all right, I've got 20 minutes with Hector and then I got to go talk to Ed, I'm not focused on Hector. I'm focused on getting out of here in 20 minutes or less so I can go talk to Ed. There could be an argument made that I'm actually focusing on Ed in that situation. So because of the time constraints, we tend to try to get straight to the point. And oftentimes we look at that as a good thing. I'm a straightforward guy. Let's just get right to it. Well, we might be comfortable with that, but our audience might not. And if our audience isn't, it doesn't matter that we are. If we are engaging in a very important conversation, what we want doesn't make a difference. We need to be communicating with people in a way that makes them feel comfortable giving us the information we need. With all due respect to everything you have all earned in your career, if we are having a conversation with somebody and they have information and we need it, we're not in control of this conversation. They are. They're the ones who are going to choose what they tell us and what they don't. So the sooner we can just embrace that and be patient and let the conversation come to us, we will have the opportunity to learn so much more. Silence is golden. I agree. There are plenty of times where someone will finish the statement and I'll just look at them and say, and they'll keep right on talking. They'll fill the gap. I agree. We can't learn if we don't give people the room to speak. And considering there's a direct relationship between the decisions we make and the information we had available at the time, being patient and letting the conversation come to you is critical. As a quick analogy, as I try to keep an eye on the clock, and if you could do me a favor and just message me the time you want me to finish, just so I make sure I don't screw this up and go over. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Thank you. One quick analogy. There are two, well, it's starting to change, but for a long time, decades, there were two leading interrogation techniques here in the United States. One starts with the investigator saying, I know exactly what you did. The other starts with the investigator doing about a 10-minute educational monologue before they ever get to any questions about the activity that happened. You would think that the direct path would be the quickest. On average, thank you, Ed. On average, that direct technique takes at least 45 minutes to get the truth. On average, the technique that uses the 10-minute monologue, 17 and a half minutes. Let the conversation come to you. You learn so much more, you create a different dynamic, you make better decisions. And then finally, we touched on this earlier, please observe for indications of comfort and discomfort. When I tell people that my background is interview and interrogation, the two things they jump on is, Mike, can you teach us how to ask great questions? And can you teach us how to catch people lying? Questions? Yeah, absolutely. We can work on that for days. How to catch somebody lying? Let's stop fooling ourselves. That path is fraught with peril. Yes, there are some opportunities there, but realistically speaking, the bad potential outweighs the good potential by a significant amount. If we stop and think about it, I won't do a show of hands. I know many of you have your cameras off as hopefully you're enjoying a meal at this point in the day. If we stop and think about it, I think it's a safe bet that all of us have told at least one lie in our lives. Okay. I think it's also probably a safe bet that most of us still work with somebody who has lied to us before. And I think it's also a safe bet to say that we all have somebody in our personal lives who we love, who was lied to us at least one time before. So my rhetorical question now is, if we are all liars who work with liars and love liars, why are we so addicted to catching people lying, considering the potential negative outcomes of that endeavor? What we should be doing is observing intently for indications of comfort and discomfort. And at any point in the conversation, if somebody appears more uncomfortable than normal or more comfortable than they should, that becomes an alert signal for us. And now we can ask ourselves, why are they more or less comfortable than they were previously? What's the likely motivation behind that in the context of this situation? And now how do I adapt my approach based on that observation? That is one of the key steps to listening for strategic intelligence. And I can provide many more resources to help you guys with that after the session if you're interested. And then Gerard, I do see unless the individual is a psychopath or a sociopath. You are correct, sir. The last I saw, and some of you, based on what you do, might have more accurate information than me. I believe roughly 7% of the population fits the clinical diagnosis for being a psychopath or a sociopath. That number may be wrong, so if you know it, correct me, please. But that was the last number that I was aware of. So while you are correct, thankfully that is by far the least amount of people that we have to worry about. I do believe for an absolute fact I've interrogated one sociopath for sure, maybe a few more that I'm not entirely so sure about. So here's what you do. It's one piece of advice. If you find yourself in that situation, when we're talking to a psychopath or a sociopath, two quick examples. One, which it'd take me forever to find on YouTube, but it's there. There's a video of Charles Manson being interviewed by a female reporter. And he is trying to absolutely railroad the conversation, take it places she doesn't want to go. And she does a genius thing. She lets him go. She sits there and just lets him go and rant like a crazy man for as long as he wants. When he's done, she says, thank you, and starts asking her questions, which he now starts answering. So one alternative, and you can use these in combination, is to literally let them take the conversation where they want it to go and then start bringing it back once you have the opportunity. The second is the devil is in the details. A lot of people, and not even just with psychopaths and sociopaths, people who are super charismatic and witty and think on their feet and feel like they can fool their way through any given conversation, struggle with details. They're great when the story is this deep, not so great when the story gets this deep. So the more we can patiently, and I saw this before, with curiosity, not with defensiveness, not attacking, ask follow-up questions and just narrow it, and listen for more specific details, we should be able to tell pretty quickly if this person is capable of what they're saying or not. And to that end, there's also a really good time to start talking about barriers to the truth. When we think about why people will commit to what we want to do on some occasions and not on others, it's important for us to consider what's going on in their mind that might cause them to commit or resist. The first thing we want to talk about on this slide isn't so much a barrier, but it is a concept that is critical to remember. People react the strongest to what they hear first. Literally, what they hear first. Again, not to just continue the comment about my conversation with Ed today, but I know that when Ed answers the phone, when I called him 12 minutes before the session started, if I say, hey, Ed, it's Mike Reddington, how are you? Red flags everywhere. I don't know Ed well enough, but I know if I receive that call, it's going to be a bunch of four-letter words going through my mind at that point. So I need to make sure that when Ed answers the phone, it's, hey, Ed, Mike Reddington, how you doing? So from the jump, he understands this is a good call, not a worrisome call. People react the strongest to what they hear first. My son is a 3-year-old walking, talking, live-in science experiment. I find it way more entertaining than my wife does. Some mornings when he asks to take his muffins into the living room to watch TV, I will say, no, buddy. And he'll start crying. While he's crying, I'll say, we don't want Daisy, our dog, because she has no manners, to try to eat them out of your hand. Eat them in the kitchen, and then we'll go watch some TV before we go to school. On other mornings, when he says, Daddy, can I take my muffins into the living room? I'll say, we don't want Daisy to eat those out of your hands, so let's just eat them right here. Okay, Daddy. Just because I didn't say no, the reaction is different, although the answer is the same. Please don't forget, people react the strongest to what they hear first. People also need to protect their self-image to a degree that is unreasonable. People need to protect their self-image. I'm currently involved in a coaching engagement with a professional, with a tremendous salesperson who has recently been recruited to join another organization. She's not struggling selling. She's struggling within the organization because, to quote her, she sees herself as a fixer. And there's so much that needs to be fixed, but people don't want to fix it. So literally what we're working on now is for her to use another word she can define herself by. Because as long as she sees herself as a fixer, she's not going to be able to fully focus on her job. But as soon as she can come up with something else to define herself by, she'll be able to make the switch and continue to maximize her potential because she's fantastic, absolutely fantastic. If you want somebody to do something that is your idea and not theirs, 85% of the battle is helping them line up their self-image with what we want them to do. As I look at the clock, a very abridged version to a story. On one occasion, I was called to interrogate a man who was accused of a pretty substantial amount of theft. And I knew the interviewer who was inviting me to, instead of this guy conducting the investigation, he wanted me to do it instead. So when I talked to him, I said, hey man, why are you asking me? And he said, because I don't think I can get him to admit. And I don't know where you all are from, but me being from New England, we show our affection to somebody by ridiculing them mercilessly whenever we have the chance. So as soon as he said to me, I don't think I can get him to admit, he's a buddy of mine. I light him up. I agree to do it. I fly out there. I go to his place of business the next day. They pull him up on camera, and I immediately look at him and say, well, I probably shouldn't have ran my mouth. This guy is 6'4", built, tattooed from his knuckles to his ears. He's from an inner city. He's got a tough backstory. I'm like, all right, bring him in. So we sit down and have the conversation. I'd rather be lucky than good. He admits to everything we knew about, which rarely happens. But during that conversation, he tells me that his brother is the manager of the receiving dock. And if any of you have an investigative background, you may be aware that receiving docks are like the epicenter for theft and dishonest activity for a lot of organizations. So now I've got to make the logical assumption that his brother could be involved in this too. So instead of just asking him about his brother, I told him a quick story about how close my brother and I are. And I literally told this guy that I was jealous of him because he sees his brother every day and I see my brother maybe twice a year and he's my best friend. And at one point in the story, I literally did this. I said, I can't tell you how many times my brother and I walked out of a situation going, well, that wasn't a good idea, but it didn't matter because he is my brother and I was always going to be there. And when I did that, he does this. And as soon as he did that, I said, so let me ask you this. What's the most expensive item you and your brother ever took off of the loading dock without paying for it? And word for word, he does this. Man, the air compressor. And proceeded to admit to stealing over $2,000 worth of merchandise with his brother, which probably means they took north of $4,000 worth of merchandise, but whatever, I'm going to put it in the win column and move on with my investigation. Unfortunately, his brother had the day off that day and never came back to work. Go figure. But you'll be surprised what people will commit, not comply, but commit to doing when you help them line it up with their self-image. And then please don't ever forget, the number one fear that stops most people from doing most things is not failure. It's embarrassment. It's feeling judged. It's feeling disappointed. It's feeling like we let somebody down, especially ourselves. If you're having a conversation with somebody and you want them to share information that's sensitive on any level, rule number one is don't accidentally make them feel embarrassed. Nothing like sitting down in front of somebody who runs an organization and asking them a question they don't know the answer to. That doesn't necessarily make us look smarter. It makes them potentially feel embarrassed and therefore hurts our relationship. Somebody in your organization, your family, your school, maybe was a part of something that they shouldn't have been, and we want them to tell us about it. If they feel embarrassed or they feel they're going to be judged at all, it's going to be really difficult. The number one thing we like to do is help people not feel embarrassed. A quick mistake that I'm currently working with somebody on right now is, especially as leaders, if you give somebody directions and then at the end of those directions, ask them, do you have any questions? For them to ask a question could be embarrassing, because that could mean that although we feel we're brilliant and explained everything the right way, they didn't get it, or they weren't paying attention, or they're not smart enough. So oftentimes if we ask somebody, do you have any questions? They say no, we assume that they got it and we walk away. By the time we find out they don't, it's too late. We've got problems. So instead of saying, do you have any questions? After we give directions, I love to say, that made a lot of sense up here. Might not have made so much sense out here. What questions did I create? And now by saying what questions did I create, the expectation is no longer you should understand. The expectation is now you should have questions. Also, please remember the number one reason that most adults lie most of the time, removing our aforementioned psychopaths and sociopaths, is to avoid a consequence that is either real or perceived. Again, one of the top 3 lessons I learned in the interrogation room was don't get mad when somebody lies to you. They're probably exercising the last good decision they feel like they had available in that moment. Okay, we can work with that. If they lie to us, they're giving us something to work with. Don't get mad about it. And to that end, please remember that especially in business, the vast majority of the time when somebody lies, they're not lying to hurt you. They're lying to protect themselves. And if they're lying to protect themselves, then we can figure out how to unwind that in order to get to the truth. Please don't get mad when somebody lies to you. It can take us totally off course and our emotions can overwhelm us in a very unhealthy way. And finally, please remember when people take a position, they're forced to defend it. So often if we force someone to take a position, whether we realize it or not, it becomes intractable. Intractable? I speak English most of the time. They lodge themselves in that position and they become unwilling to come out of it, no matter how rational our argument is. So as we turn from home with this presentation, now that we understand the barriers to people being truthful with us, here are a few quick things we can do to increase our ability to influence others. The first one is please don't ever forget that people interpret how we communicate with them as proof for how much we respect them. They can't see our intentions. They don't know what we say when they're not in the room. They take how we communicate with them day in, day out on a consistent basis as proof for how much we care about them. Time is the enemy of empathy. Take a few seconds or minutes at the beginning of every conversation to connect with somebody on a personal level before you end up getting to the business conversation. And on the flip side, please don't suffer death by last word. Too many times people in a powerful position feel like if they get jabbed on the way out of a conversation, they got to hit right back. Let it go. It doesn't matter. I got to speak at a conference, I got to speak at a conference that Marshall Goldsmith was also speaking at. That's probably the best way to say it. I attended his presentation. He must have been busy preparing because he didn't attend mine, but that's okay. At the end of his presentation, somebody asked him, a woman in the front row, with all the time you spent with CEOs, what have you found is the single biggest mistake that they make? And without batting an eye, he said they win too much. They're used to being in charge and getting their way, so they have to win all the time, even when it's detrimental to the business, the relationship, what they're trying to achieve. I know a couple guys that fit that description. Where I live in North Carolina, I serve on our Education Foundation Board. Every year we have a Principal for the Day event to help raise money. So there's a middle school right down the street from where I live. I go to play Principal for the Day. The principal and I walk around the corner and we see an 8th grade teacher and an 8th grade student in a robust conversation. Nothing bad, just not happy with each other. We come around the corner, boom, back in the room they go. Jeff looks at me and stops. He said, man, do you know how much easier my life would be if both the teachers and the students didn't have to have the last word? And I started laughing, which Jeff initially didn't appreciate. He said, what's so funny? I said, dude, in the last 6 days, I just learned that CEOs and 8th graders have the same problem. He started laughing and I said, what? It's like death by last word, man. Just let it go. Just let it go, especially if you run the organization. The bottom line is you're going to get what you want. You're in charge. You don't need to get the last word in that conversation. Let them walking away feeling like they got that little win. It doesn't matter. Let them have it. We're going to go on and get the results that we need after the fact. So don't forget, people interpret how we communicate with them as proof for how much we respect them. Always encourage your audience to protect their self-image. This is the 3rd time we've mentioned this in this presentation. Hopefully that gives you an idea of how important this is. If somebody wants to be treated like the smartest person in the room, please put your ego in your back pocket and do it. If somebody wants to be treated like, I don't really know what's going on here, please help me, even though you believe they do, put your ego in your back pocket and communicate that way. What's important is the results and communicating with people in a way that they are comfortable enough to share the information we need to move forward. I'm sure you've all heard state the why before the what. But one way to operationalize this really helps us in our conversations. Think about it. How many times in your life have you asked somebody to do something, and in some way, shape, or form, they looked at you and said, no? So then you give them a reason, because that reason should likely change their mind. But the problem is they already took a position. So now that they're saying no, when they're listening to that reason, they're not listening to that reason for an opportunity to change their mind. They're listening for that reason for an opportunity to reinforce the position they've already took, one little thread they can hang from. So instead, flip the script. Give them the reason or justification for what you're going to ask first. Help them line up their self-image with that reason before you pop the question. This is one of the pillars of influence that I use all the time. And when we're buying a vehicle or negotiating our home renovations or doing anything else, my wife is rolling her eyes so hard, I think they're going to fall out of her head. But I literally execute this every single time in those situations. So if I need Hector, see if I can come up with one off the top of my head. Let's say that I need Hector to help me with my nonprofit, which Hector, I don't. I'm not going anywhere with this, I promise. But I know that Hector and his team are absolutely amazing at what they do from a creative standpoint. And my nonprofit that I sit on the board on could use some image help. So I'm going to ask Hector. But I know Hector is high end and I'm representing a little nonprofit, and this could be a problem. So instead of saying to Hector, hey, Hector, could you and your team help me out with my nonprofit's logo? That'd be pretty awesome. I can't blame Hector for saying no. He's got a business to run. Time is money. He's got a team to take care of. In his heart, he probably would love to, but I can't blame him if he says no. Problem is, even Hector, unless we dig into that tequila bottle behind his shoulder, once he's taken that position, is probably going to stay there. So instead, I could say, hey, Hector, how are you? Great to see you. How's your family? Still hiking with your little girl? Everything's great. Oh, what's going on with me? Well, actually, I serve on this board for this local nonprofit. It's awesome. And one of the great things about being on a nonprofit is maximizing the limited resources we have to take care of the people we serve in our community, which in this case is students and teachers, and really using what we have to create a future that they deserve. And when we look at that, it really takes a lot of us making sacrifices with time and money and availability and with our businesses in order to try to put ourselves aside for what's most important to kids. And actually, with that in mind, if you thought about your calendar over the next 3 months, about how many hours you think you might be able to spare to help us freshen up our logo so we can raise more money for these kids? So now, once I start talking about shared sacrifices for the benefits of kids, I can't see Hector right now, but I guarantee he's doing this. Yep, who wouldn't do that? So now that I've lined his self-image up with making shared sacrifices to benefit kids, I'm ready to pop the question. But when I pop the question, it's not a can you do it? It's how many hours might you have available over the next 3 months? As soon as he stops to think about it, now you're saying there's a chance. Maybe he comes back with 1 hour, 2 hours, whatever it is. Now there might even be some small commitment where he's willing to say, well, just let me take a look at it and see if I can freshen it up. When I'm on, well, I guess we don't get on airplanes anymore. So, but when I'm kind of multitasking, maybe I'll try to freshen it up to help you out. If we state the why before the what, we will be so much more successful. Another trick I used there was when I used that illustration, the why, I didn't say the word you. If I said, Hector, I see you as a guy that really cares about the community and kids and teachers in the future and wanting to give people a great chance that might not have one. I think that's real important to you. That sounds so judgmental. Even though it's wicked positive, it still sounds so judgmental. But instead, if I speak in the third person, I use plural examples and say, for leaders who involve themselves in nonprofits, that means making shared sacrifices for the benefit of these kids, whether that's with our personal time or business resources, whatever it is. So now by using that group illustration, there are 7 automatic mechanisms of persuasion. I'm kicking off at least 4 of them. Well, at least 3. I'd probably argue 4 out of the 7. As I tell this story, just by using that plural example. Please limit how you say you. You is the most dangerous word in the English language as far as I'm concerned. Every time we say the word you, we're tripping all over somebody's self-image. But if I can say, when we speak with leaders, when we speak with educators, when we speak with our best employees, anytime we have the opportunity to partner with such great businesses. Now I'm helping them protect their self-image. They don't feel threatened. It increases the perception of my credibility, and we obtain commitments we never thought we were capable of achieving. And then here's another big one. Please assign accountability at the end of the conversation, not the beginning. Believe it or not, excuses are gold. I bet everybody on this call wants to go nuts when they hear somebody giving an excuse for why something wasn't done. Love those excuses. Love them. When somebody gives you an excuse, they're expecting you to battle back. Instead, don't. Just accept it. Unpack it and work your way backwards. It's the last thing that they're expecting. Start with that excuse. Great, tell me more. Keep working through that excuse until it unravels and they start accepting their own accountability at the end of the conversation. I've got a whole other video actually on this that I'll share, so you guys can watch it if you want. But it's really important. Assign responsibility at the end of the conversation, not the beginning. I think we've got about 5 minutes left. So with the last two slides we have, the title of this slide is Intentional. Get what you ask for. All too often, as professionals, as investigators, as parents, we get exactly what we ask for, and that's not a good thing. So in order to improve the information that we obtain, please remember that questions can be perceived as invitations or attacks. How we phrase our question, the pace we deliver our question, the tone we use when we ask our question. One of the all-time best compliments I ever got in an interrogation room, again, one of my former teammates asked me to do an interrogation because based on previous relationships, the interrogator who worked at this location felt she would never be able to get this woman to admit. This woman had all kinds of performance and attitude problems, and it was pretty rough around the edges. I was halfway through getting this woman's confession. My colleague who had called me in was the note taker, writing down everything this woman confessed to. We went out to lunch after. Jennifer pulled her notepad around with a star about 2/3 of the way down the confession she was taking notes on and said, Mike, I was taking notes here when I realized she was confessing. Thankfully, I was delivering the questions in such a way that not only had I soothed the suspect into telling me, but I'd soothed my professional interrogator note taker into writing it all down without realizing how deep we were into the conversation. Please don't never forget, questions can be perceived as invitations or attacks, and people will react accordingly. Also, please remember, how you set up your questions is more important than the questions that you ask. A great setup, like the one we just modeled for Hector. We set up a question really well, we might get away with asking a question that's not so good. We don't set up a question at all, we could really, really lose taking advantage of a great question that should have created dividends for us. Please remember, how you set up your question is more important than the question that you ask. Also, please avoid implied expected answers. These happen when we ask questions where the right answer is obvious. If you ask somebody a question and the right answer is obvious and they give you the right answer, even though it's not the truth, it's not their fault, it's ours. All too often, Aaron, thank you. All too often, we answer questions reflexively, not reflectively. So if we ask somebody in a stressful situation a question where the right answer is obvious, they may reflexively give us that answer, and then we get mad because we think they lied. When in all actuality, they just gave us the answer that the question was leaning towards. Careful with those. These are my favorite open questions. My favorite question to ask anybody is walk me through, because walk me through implies detail, depth, and logical progression, which makes it easier for me to identify where any comfort, discomfort, or gaps in the story may be. Also, please stop asking people, do you remember? If you ask somebody, do you remember, they're going to give us whatever answer benefits them, yes or no, which may be the truth, it may not. So instead, ask them, take me back to. Please take me back to. That question should be far more effective for you more often than not than do you remember. And finally, on this slide, assumptive questions are my favorite questions. If you know, with the question we did with Hector, I didn't ask, can you help? I asked, how many hours might you have available? So I'm making the assumption that there's at least one. If there's not, he'll tell me. but I love asking questions around how, when, and what. In fact, how and when are my two favorite. These are my absolute favorite ways to prefix questions. And Ed, I love what you just said, or maybe not having to ask the question if you set it up well. Amen. Amen. Especially in sales. Some of my most successful discovery meetings, I might ask 4 questions and they're purely logistical because we set the first one up so well, they give us all the information we need. I know you're all super busy and a couple of you had to sign off. I can't thank you enough for sharing your time with me today. So I'm going to share one more quick slide and then I've got some time to stick around and answer questions if people have the time to hang on. So generally, what my organization does is we provide training engagements, whether they are keynote presentations or more often multi-day engagements. But underneath that, we also do one-on-one and small group training and advising. And anytime I'm called in to do a one-on-one advisory session or series of sessions with a leader, I'm going to ask them 3 questions. I'm going to give him our disciplined listening leadership test because the problems might be technical or operational or financial, and those might be a little bit outside of my expertise. That's okay. There are 3 core things as leaders from a communication standpoint, 3 core questions that we need to answer. And if the answers to these questions are yes, we can solve just about any other problem. If the answer to these questions are no, we've got to fix these first. So when we do those advisory engagements, the first 3 questions we ask the leaders and their direct reports are as follows. Are you calm? Are you consistent? And are you making people better? If the people around us perceive us to be calm, to be consistent, and to be truly dedicated to making people better, then we can solve almost any other problem with our team. The foundation is there. If these pieces aren't in place, we likely have to fix these first. So the next time you're reflecting upon yourselves or other leaders on your team or within your organizations or those that you coach, please ask yourself or ask them, does your audience perceive you to be calm, consistent, and making people better? Again, I can't thank you all for your time. Thank you so very much. If you have any questions, I'm happy to stick around. Here's my contact information. If you'd like to follow up with anything, please feel free. The only social media I'm really on is LinkedIn, Michael Reddington, CFI. So if you want to link up there, I'd be happy to. Please stay safe. Please stay healthy. Over the coming months, there's still challenges ahead for sure for all of us. Please stay safe. Please stay healthy and take care of each other. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.